Boozehounds. Written by Robert H. Butler. Narrated by Hal Parks. Chapter 1. "Captain, we got a problem," the first mate said while looking up from his control panel. "Of course we have a problem. We have lots of problems. We have so many problems that if we could fit those in the cargo hold and sell them for a credit each, we'd all be rich," the captain replied, her voice thick with the sarcasm their native tongue did nothing to disguise. Her bushy tail stiffened more with each dripping word, and the silence sat still as an unimpacted asteroid before them broke it to say, "But what is our new problem?" "A warning buoy indicates that this area is quarantined due to the presence of Zenny raiders. Transmission states that all ships should divert course by 27 light years around the Sundari Road." His tail was no less stiff than hers, and all of his ears were down. He wasn't happy, and it showed. "And if we just go through this area, how much fuel will that save?" she asked. Her bright reddish-orange fur bristled as she looked down her snout at him from her seat at the center of the bridge. "Enough to make it, but if we encounter the Zenny, we don't have any torpedoes left, and we don't have enough power in the system core to use blasters. Even if we reroute power from the engines, all that means is that we'll end up adrift in the void in a quarantine zone." Her first mate didn't need to finish that sentence. No Delamison ship was going to go into the quarantine zone after a distress call. The Zenny had used that trick often enough to lure in prey. So, it's a death sentence, she realized. "And if we go around the way the buoy orders?" she asked. "We run out of fuel halfway to the next warp station. We go down to drift speed in a few days and shut down most of the ship's life support to stretch things out. But we eventually die in the void unless we pick up a rescue," he admitted without raising his snout to look up at her. "And then what?" the captain pressed. "Then, if we get rescued, we probably can't pay for it. We sell the ship and go back to Delamis and—" He didn't have to finish that sentence either. The answer was obvious to both of them. He was either back to life as frontier scouts for the Delamison military, or try to make a go at living some other way in a hidebound and fairly joyless existence on the home world. Such were the two fates of outliers. "So on one tooth," the captain said, "we can risk a possible quick death in the void by Zenny raiders, or make it to our destination and keep our ship going for a while. Or on the other tooth, we can have a choice between a slow death in the void, or if we're rescued, a slow death of working in misery at home or for the military again. That right? So, your orders, Captain? Do we heed the buoy, or—" he asked. He straightened up a little. He could see the spark in her bright amber eyes. "Buoy? What buoy? I see no buoy anywhere. Too bad our communication systems are down, and we can't pick up any transmissions." She raised one part of her lip and leveled her arm, pointing straight ahead. "Forward!" she said. Ma'am, we're actually going to be turning into the road. You're pointing the wrong direction," the first mate pointed out. "When you're pointing dramatically, first mate, it doesn't matter whether you're pointing in the right direction or not," she clapped back, and he bowed his head to her wisdom. "As you command, Captain," he answered and gave a nod towards their navigation officer. Their ship, the Red Spark, banked into the drifting space rocks that had floated among one another since the dawn of time. A thick glare of dust drifted everywhere, the remnants of asteroids that had broken against one another of their sort again and again and again, in an endless dance that reduced them until they could be reduced no more. The Sundari Road was the de facto border between not just multiple systems, but various intelligent species. It wound its way in a long, thick road between the stars, in a rare, wobbly orbit. Its path was dictated by stars that alternately pushed and pulled them, thus creating an unusual pattern found nowhere else in the known galaxy. A road-like pattern that made it orbit more than one star, and which provided valuable mining opportunities in centuries past. Bravado or not, the captain of the Delamison freighter felt every bit of tension from her fur to her bone marrow as they went into the sea of stones that drifted through the void. Zenny. Vile scum, she privately thought. The hard-shelled creatures had natural armor to their bodies that was difficult to pierce, and they were one of the most dangerous species in the galaxy for their xenophobic hatred and propensity to plunder. How many outposts were lost before they were pushed back? She had wondered. Nobody knew for sure. Most governments kept their losses private. But what was public knowledge was why the Zinni ultimately pulled back. And that reason was one of the reasons that the captain of the Red Spark felt confident despite the risk. Humans have stepped up patrols here, and the Zinni won't go anywhere near a place they suspect humans who have ships in active service, she reminded herself and tried to stay optimistic. Humans haven't been on the scene long, but they were the craziest people in the stars. The story came to mind immediately, of the Zinni cutter that severed a human marine's arm, only for him to pick up the severed arm and beat the Zinni to death with it. Nobody wants to fight a species like that. It was reassuring at least, though she didn't credit that story with much real truth. Rumors are rumors. They're just another new species with a few oddities. Even if they're as predatory in their evolution as we are, the Zinni were probably just being cautious. That was the prevailing conclusion of most everybody. A new species of unknown characteristics joining the intergalactic community didn't happen every decade. But her idle musings were interrupted when the comm channel on the bridge interrupted in a loud warning bark. "Zinni! We got a dozen Zinni cruisers coming in hot! A dozen?" The whole bridge erupted in an outcry. While Zinni's ships were fast and maneuverable, they were also typically few in numbers. A dozen wasn't impossible, but it was unlikely unless they had an outpost of their own. They must have an outpost somewhere close by. All power to weapons, and send out a warning about the base. Fire when ready! She shouted the orders before she was halfway out of her chair. She didn't have to order the incoming ships to be put on screen. The view snapped onto the screen, and her first officer immediately shouted, "Shields up!" His eyes bulged as he looked at the monitor. There were indeed a dozen ships. They were well out of range, but fast and light as they were, a slow freighter had no chance of outrunning them. Their standard teardrop design was sleek and smooth, each one large enough to hold a crew of 50, 20 crew, and the rest of their warrior class. "No! No shields!" the captain shouted. "Put every drop of energy into the weapons. They're not going to take this ship without a fight that most of them won't live to remember." The bridge was quiet. "All power to weapons! You heard the captain!" the first mate shouted, and the hum of the weapon console went up. "Stick to the asteroids. We'll use them to block as much as we can. And keep the transmission going. Let the whole system know how long it took the Red Spark to go out." She gave the order, and the bridge shouted back, "Yes, ma'am!" The Lamazan merchant sailors began to snarl and growl, baring their teeth as they prepared for a fight. An apex predatory species in their own right, and a crew full of ex-military scouts. Their captain could not help but feel proud of their resolve as she flicked on the general comm channel for the ship. "Crew," she said as clearly and calmly as she could, "it's been an honor to lead you. The Zinni are inbound, and there's a dozen ships to our one. We can't hope to win. And you know they can't take any prisoners. This is it. This is our last voyage together, and all I can say is, get ready to crack some shells, and make it the last voyage for as many of them as you can. Arm yourselves, and defend your ship!" She killed the comm and reclaimed her seat just as the first torpedoes of the raiders winked into view on screen. Her helmsmen steered their ship close to an asteroid, and the ship rocked as the blast radiated against the hull. But the explosion did nothing but create more little asteroids out of a big one. "Return fire! First crack belongs to us!" she shouted, and their blasters flared to life from the front. The red pulse pounded the raiders, causing the shields to flare briefly before the energy was dissipated. "If I live through this, I'm buying stronger blasters," she reflected, and the battle wore on. Minute after minute, hour after hour. The Zinni had one weakness. They wanted to take the Red Spark, not destroy it. And as such, their weapons were aimed at disabling the ship and its weapons, or opening a hole they could force their way into. Meanwhile, the Red Spark was out to destroy the raiders, and had no compunction about doing so. So the fighting continued, the freighter weaving in and out of asteroids, taking shots only when they were sure they could hit, while avoiding letting the engines be hit and turn. But the end result was obvious as minute turned into hour. The Zinni cores were fresh, and would supply enough energy that the occasional glancing strike would eventually crack the hull. and they kept a large cache of torpedoes on hand if they needed them. Meanwhile, every shot of the red spark was reducing the engine life all on its own. Eventually it would be over. Hand to hand can have only one end, but what an end it will be. She tapped the side of her captain's chair and drew out a glove tipped with claws, a standard Delamis and hand-to-hand weapon, and her personal sidearm, a lead spitter with 30 rounds ready to use. The rest of her crew was imitating her action. By now, most of her ship's crew would have congregated at defensive positions close to the bridge. "How much energy do we have left?" she asked, her voice even, her nerves steeled. "Enough for another hour or two, so not enough, Captain," the helmsman answered. "Fine. Kill the engine. Leave just enough power for the comm to keep going." The crew stopped and stared at her. "Do it. And as soon as they get close, give them everything," the captain clarified, and understanding dawned. "Ma'am," the helmsman replied, and as orders were relayed, the hum of the engines died. The ship began to darken as power was drained from every room, and the teardrop ships of the Zinni Raiders grew larger. Their weapon fire ceased as they realized they had successfully run down their prey. The Zinni ships closed in, and the little bark of the captain's comm went up. She didn't have to think about it before hitting the acknowledgement icon. "Surrender, and you will go to sleep in silence." The ominous order was a fairly benign way of saying that they would die painlessly. It was a common Zinni expression. The captain smacked the video display, connecting their video monitors, and as soon as the faceless shell of the Zinni appeared in front of her, she bared her teeth and howled, "Fire!" The red spark drained every drop of energy but what it needed for life support and comm transmissions into the shots, and on the screen 3 Zinni ships exploded in an instant, having come too close and dropping their guard. "We're not tired yet, Zinni. Come and get us!" She shouted at the screen and killed the link between them. "Get ready. This is our last stand. And keep that transmission going." She shouted her order at the comm station, and they took up fighting positions, ready to open fire at the door. 300 Delamis Scout-class sailors would put up a nightmare of a fight, and the Zinni would have little to celebrate. But the end was clear. The damage indicator came on. The Zinni cutting team were working. 3 out of 12 isn't bad. And we probably disabled 2 more. Oh well. It was a good... Her thoughts were interrupted when the comm officer shouted to her, "Ma'am, incoming transmission." "Play it," she shouted, but kept her eyes on the door. Yee-haw! "What's a yee-haw?" the captain wondered and snapped an order. "On screen!" The face was hairless and flat and fairly pale, with hazel eyes and dark hair, and he wore what she recognized as clothing, something most races didn't use, which narrowed it down fairly quickly. A human, she realized, and the view snapped to show several incoming human ships. "Y'all got a little pest control problem here? We'll clear it up for y'all if y'all's like," the human offered. "I'm not saying no," the Delamis captain answered, and the human looked over his shoulder. "Shell the crabs!" he said, and the human energy weapons began to rake over the Zinni ships caught off guard. It took them a moment to scatter, and 2 more were destroyed before they could. Those that had connected to the side of the Delamis fighter needed time to draw back, and a moment later 2 more were destroyed. The fight around the red spark was short and sweet to the Delamis captain's eyes. The humans brought warships, meaning that the raiders effectively brought knives to a gunfight. Built for maximum damage and able to do wide area damage, the pursuing human ships seemed to be having fun, picking off the Zinni survivors with wide area blasts that sent asteroids out of stable orbits held for billions of years, rocketing off into the void. When it was over at last, and 2 of the warships have gone in pursuit of the last of the teardrops, the transmission came in again, and the Delamis ship captain was quick to smack the accept icon. "We figured there was a Zinni outpost hidden out here somewhere. We've been hunting for them for a few weeks now. What are y'all doing out here? Nothing piratey, I hope?" he asked and furrowed his brow. "No. We just couldn't turn a profit without the shortcut. We did get the word, but we had to chance it, Captain Yee-Haw." It wasn't an apology. She had no intention to apologize for violating the quarantine, and the human, to her surprise, seemed to understand. Or so she guessed from the nod. I'm Captain Reginald Archer. Yee-haw is just something we say when we're a little too excited about our work." He gave his uniform a little tug and huff. His face turned a little red and he coughed into his hand, clearing his throat before asking, "You got a name there, Captain?" She turned off her translator and spoke, and he cocked his head. "That sounds more like music. I can't say that." She turned on the translator and said, "Then call me whatever," she said. "I owe you for our lives, Captain Archer. I will not begrudge you picking something for convenience's sake." He looked her up and down across the gulf between ships and species alike. "Put your lives at risk for profit, and we've been chasing your transmission for hours. You gave a dozen Zenny Raiders a run for their money for a lot longer than you had any business doing. Plus, by God, you look magnificent, if you'd forgive the personal assessment." She said nothing, though it was hard not to preen a little and tilt her jaw proudly. "Very piratey," he finally said, and then nodded more to himself than anyone else. "If you're all right with it, then I'd like to call you Bonny Red, Captain Bonny Red." "That'll do just fine. I like the sound of that," Captain Bonny said with a sharp nod, accepting the name he offered, and though she couldn't explain it, it felt right, like the first time she had taken her seat in her chair and called the Red Spark her own. I haven't felt that way in a long time. Something tells me that was one of those moments where everything starts to change, and I think I like it.